Hi, we are looking at Chapter 2, Heredity and Conception. So this chapter we're looking at heredity, and heredity defines our nature. So this chapter is all about nature and not so much about nurture. Um, we're looking at traits, whether you exhibit traits or be a carrier of a trait, and the field of study is genetics. So every the biology study that you would want to go into, if this is interesting to you, the field of study is genetics. And what geneticists look at are the traits that are transmitted by our chromosomes or our genes, or we can call them alleles. So each cell has a chromosome which has 46 cells or alleles in it. Half of what you get are from your mother and half are what you get from your father. One of the interesting things too about this is that less than 1% of our DNA is what makes us human. 98%, we're 98.5% we share with chimps, 75% roughly with a dog. We share about 50% of our DNA with a fruit fly and about 30% with a daffodil. So fertilization, as you saw with chapter 1, is very complicated, and about 50% of pregnancies spontaneously abort where the mother does not even know she is pregnant. But the mother has the ova, which is 23 chromosomes, and the sperm from the father has 23 chromosomes, and together that makes 46 chromosomes, and the sperm is the father is the one that determines the sex of the baby. So you can see that here that the female has an XX chromosome, the male has an XY chromosome, and if the child gets the Y from the father, then it is a baby boy. Some of the interesting facts about sperm is that the Y chromosomes have greater motility, which means they are faster swimmers. About 120 to 150 boys are conceived for every 100 girls. But the problem is that more boys' eggs spontaneously abort during the first month of pregnancy. Again, sometimes most of the time when the mother does not even know. So at birth, by the time the babies are born, at birth, the boys outnumber girls by a ratio of 106 to 100. Although with boys having a higher incidence of infant mortality, it's usually around 102 or 103 in certain years to 100. Here is a interesting science selection. So we've gotten so far ahead in science, and this is probably outdated, and there's even better science now, but this kind of talks about the three processes of selecting a sex. So this first one, the microsort method, is where they insert a color dye on attach it to the certain colors attached to the X chromosome and certain colors attached to the Y chromosome. Here they show pink and blue. That's not the colors they use, but you can then take the sex that you are going for and insert that in our artificial insemination, if you were that gung-ho to get that sex of the child. The second way is in vitro fertilization, and that is when an egg and a sperm are fertilized in a laboratory, and after so many days the fertilized zygote sheds some skin cells, and they can extract those and determine whether it's male or female. And then the last method, which is the Erickson method, or they'll call it the spinning method, is where they take the X and Y chromosomes, spin it around, and Y chromosomes are heavier and go to the bottom, and X rise to the top. So when we talk about inheriting our genes from our parents. Genes are also called alleles. We get 23 alleles from our mother, 23 from our father, and we receive our genes in a homozygous pattern, which means that they are the same alleles from both parents. So if that happens, the child will display the inherited trait. So homo means same, zygos means pattern. If we get our traits or alleles in a heterozygous manner, that means that the instructions from both parents, we get the dominant gene or allele followed by the recessive gene, and the recessive gene is always ignored and the dominant is always followed. And so to give an example of what that looks like, because that is a confusing thing unless we look at it. If we look at, or actually here, let me go back. If we look at brown eyes and blue eyes. Brown eyes are a dominant trait and blue eyes are a recessive trait. So if both of our parents have brown eyes, we are getting the homozygous trait and we will have brown eyes. If we have one parent with blue eyes and one parent with brown eyes, then we are getting brown eyes because it's still a dominant trait and the recessive trait is ignored. But if we have two homozygous blue-eyed parents, then we will get blue eyes as well, generally. And that was a very, I'll show you a better in depth because that's not always the case. But dominant traits are the ones that are expressed. So we may have the recessive traits or we may not have the recessive traits, but the dominant traits are the ones that are going to be expressed, which is what we're going to see. The chemical instructions are followed off of our DNA and dominant is always expressed. It can be heterozygous or homozygous. It means that you can have one of each, but again, you're going to only display the dominant trait. Recessive traits can only be expressed if they are homozygous. So that means that they are carriers of the trait. So that means that both parents have the recessive gene. And so if we look at this one, we see two brown-eyed parents. Both of them have recessive gene of blue eyes. Their first child would be a brown-eyed child with no recessive genes. The second and third child would be both brown-eyed children, but they would have the recessive trait of blue eyes. And then which means they are carriers. And then the last child would be a blue-eyed child. And again, this is not saying that the fourth child will always be blue-eyed. It means that they have a 25% chance of being a blue-eyed child. Another example is here if we look at PKU, which is a disease, a genetic disorder. That means you are allergic almost to milk or proteins that are found in milk, which is what infants eat, right? So it's super important that you find out right away if the child has PKU. We can see how it presents here. So if the mother and father, neither one of them has a recessive gene, then none of their children will have PKU. But now if mom has a recessive gene, she only carries PKU. She does not have it, but mom has it. There are a 50% chance that the children will be a carrier of that gene, which is important when we talk about genetic testing, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, if both mom and dad are carriers, but they do not have it, there is a 25% chance that a child will have PKU. So you can see over here. So out of 4 children, if we're looking at 25% chances, 25% chance that that the child does not have anything. 50% chance that the child is a carrier, and then 25% that the child has PKU. And so in your homework assignment, we're going to look at in questions 7 and 8, where you're going to actually talk about, you'll answer which traits you have that are recessive or dominant. If it is a recessive trait, it means that both your parents have it. If it's dominant, you may not know, although if it's something as common as blonde hair versus brown hair, you're going to know who has the hair color in your family. Genetic counseling. Here is a graph to tell you about genetic counseling and possibly getting genetic counseling if you're concerned about if you don't know your genetic makeup. So a lot of times, like we said with the PKU, you may be a carrier, but you may not know that that is something in your family. So this is a chart that helps you kind of figure out if you want to consider genetic counseling with your partner. And you can talk about, is the prenatal diagnosis possible? If it's not, can the condition be treated at birth? Yes, then have the baby. No, maybe avoid the pregnancy or consider adoption. Again, this is really a personal choice. This is what the genetic counselor would talk to you about. If you would not consider abortion at all, then maybe don't have the test, become pregnant, or think about possibly adopting and not becoming pregnant. So again, super, this is really couples' choices on whether they want to get genetic counseling. Sometimes having more information is better to make a decision. The last thing I want to talk about is epigenetics. This is an interesting fact. It's the relationship between genetics and environmental influences. So not only your DNA determines who you are, but possibly your environmental influence as well. So we may have genes for many disorders. So let's say bipolar disorder, but you never actually get it. And if you do get it, it's determined because it's turned on, that gene is turned on or becomes activated if maybe you experience a traumatic event, or possibly poor diet, lack of nutrition. Something in your environment causes that gene to be turned on and for you to express it. So it's a new interesting way of looking at science, and now you can't always blame just your parents.